As they make their way out, let me just lay the groundwork for today's sermon. It's going to be very similar to last week's in the sense that it's a lot of content to cover, and I'm not even going to attempt to do that in one single sermon on a Sunday morning. When you look at the life of Joseph, last week we spent some time looking at the life of Isaac as one of the patriarchs of our faith and one of the pillars of the Old Testament. And one of the things that I mentioned about Isaac was that he has the shortest amount of content in the book of Genesis. It's really just one chapter. Of course, he's mentioned in a couple of other chapters briefly with his lineage and things like that. But he's the shortest in terms of how much is there about him. Primarily, his story is found there in Genesis chapter 26. And today, we're going to swing the pendulum to the other end of the spectrum. And we're going to look at the character in Genesis who gets the most attention and the most content, and that is the character of Joseph. And kind of pitting these two against each other, there's a lot of similarities, of course, that I want to draw upon. But Isaac is one who is called to stay. In a time that everyone was probably tempted to go down to Egypt and go to the Nile, which was the breadbasket of the community there, and that's where people went because it had the Nile River, so you had the ability to eat. You had water even in a time of drought or even in a time of famine. Pretty much everybody else in the Old Testament that we consider to be pillars of our faith at some point in their life went down to Egypt. They made some sort of trek down to Egypt for one reason or another, and so a famine falls upon the land, and Isaac picks up his family, and he's on his way out, and God calls upon him to stay, and to stay in the land. And in that staying, we see God renew the covenant that he established with Abraham with Isaac. So he renews that covenant, and what we see in between these two characters, and of course we're skipping over Jacob, and there's much that could be said about Jacob as well, but kind of pitting these two against each other, what we see from these two characters is that God's people are not secured by location, but by his presence. God calls Isaac to stay when it didn't make sense to stay. He calls him to plant when it didn't make sense to plant. He calls him to not leave and leave this area and go down to Egypt, but to stay right there. And through his faith, that covenant is renewed, and God's people and his promises of land, seed, and blessing are carried out through Isaac's obedience. Isaac's faith was one that was willing to stay. And so a bulk of last Sunday's sermon was spent looking at how difficult sometimes it is to stay and do the hard work of remaining where God has you. Sometimes it's hard to stay when everything else about our circumstances suggests that we need to leave. We need to move on. We need to find somewhere else to go. We need to pick up and have a fresh start. Sometimes God calls us to stay. Did you have the faith to stay like Isaac? Have you had the faith to stay like Isaac when God calls you to stay? But Joseph's faith was on the other end of that spectrum. Joseph's faith was one that was willing to go even when he didn't plan to. When he had no intention of leaving the land. When he's faithful and he's obedient to his father. I mean, Genesis 37, if nothing else, depicts Joseph as an obedient, favored son of his father Jacob. He wants to do everything right by Jacob. And there's bitterness and there's jealousy and there's envy, and there's favoritism, and there's all these different things that are happening in this family at the time. But Joseph's faith wasn't just that he could stay and be obedient. It was that when God sent him somewhere else, despite his best efforts to do the right thing where he was, he said, okay, Lord, I'll go. So we look at Isaac's life, and we see that through Isaac's obedience, God's covenant was renewed by his staying. But then we look at Joseph's life and we see that God's covenant was preserved by his willingness to go. And oftentimes in our lives, it's not either or with that, it's both and. There are certainly times in my life that I can look back in hindsight and see that God called me to stay and that he was renewing something that he had promised to me. But there's also seasons in my life that I can look back and I can see that God was preserving something that he had spoken into my life or that he had promised me or that he was doing in my life when I left and I didn't planned to go. One of the things that we see through all the patriarchal narratives of Genesis, which is such a deep book, you could just spend so much time walking through these stories, is that God accomplishes his perfect purposes even when we cannot see or understand his hand. And thus we have the title for our series, Trusting God's Heart Even When You Can't See His Hand. Sometimes that's staying right where you are, despite the circumstances. Sometimes it's being willing to say, yes, Lord, even when we go, when we did not intend to go. A couple of things I want to bring out from our text this morning. And again, the story of Joseph really goes all the way from Genesis 37 all the way through the end of the book into Genesis 50 until we get Exodus there. I'm at the end of the story. And Joseph's story begins with promises. So we're going to talk about a word today that is often misused or abused in churches, and that's providence. And we're going to look at Joseph's story through the lens of God's providence. And what I hope and pray is that you can see God's providence in your own story and in your own life. But what I know experientially, and then also from study looking at not just Joseph, but different characters in the Bible, is that God's providence often appears hidden. I mean, we want the answers to what God is doing right now so many times. But oftentimes they're veiled from us. We don't understand. We don't see why he's moving things the way he's moving them. We see things on a right now, surface level picture. And God's providence often appears hidden. If you did not grow up in church and you're not familiar with Joseph, there's still probably a couple of things that you know about his life that you've heard through the grapevine through the years, or maybe you went to church with somebody else. But those of us who grew up in church and our parents carried us and grandparents carried us to church as children, we know this story very well. And one of the things that we run the risk of when we get really familiar with a story is simply reducing some of these stories to moral principles. And man, there are a ton of principles that are in Joseph's story. There are so many things that we can carry out from reading Genesis 37 through 50 about how we can live a life and be faithful and flee from temptation and be honorable in our work and do the right thing and trust in God that he's going to deliver us up out of seasons of imprisonment and accusation and things like that. But Joseph's story begins with promises. And it begins in the promised land. And he's the favorite son of his father, so there's favoritism already. So you could look at even parenting and some of the patriarchal stories about how we need to avoid favoritism and the damage that it can do within a household. Then you get into kind of his dealings with his brothers, and you see this sibling rivalry emerge. So Joseph was the one who had the tunic of many colors, or you may know it as the coat of many colors. And this was Jacob's way of saying that Joseph was his favorite because he was the son that was given to him in his old age. So this immediately puts resentment in this family. And so now there's bitterness, there's stress, there's all these things happening in this household. And then to make matters worse, he receives these dreams. And he goes to his brothers and he starts to tell them about these dreams. And he's like, look, I'm having these dreams, and basically you guys are all going to bow down to me one day. How about that? How's that sound? Does it sound good with you guys? So he goes to his brothers and he kind of, that's a very gross summarization there, but he goes to his brothers and he says, I'm having these dreams, and it just throws gasoline on the fire. And things in this household and things in this family start to get even more bitter and even more intense. And God has spoken clearly to him, it appears. I mean, he's in the promised land. He's not the son of promise from Jacob, but he's the favored son of Jacob in his father's household. He's doing everything that he's supposed to be doing. He goes above and beyond when Jacob gives him a task to go and do out in the field. So the early narrative on Joseph is that I believe Moses is trying to get us to pick up on is that he lived right. He was doing things the right way. He was striving for faithfulness. He was striving to live in an obedient manner. And he's got these promises that are spoken clearly over his life. Then almost immediately, here in this story, his brothers hate him. He's thrown into a pit. I mean, they consider killing him. Instead, they put together this story of how he can be thrown into a pit, and then somebody sees this caravan coming, and so they say, hey, instead of throw him into this pit, we can actually profit from this. We can gain from this whole situation. So they pull him out of the pit, and they sell him into a Midianite caravan, and they carry him to Egypt. So he's immediately sold into slavery hundreds of miles away. He's falsely accused of something that he did not do, and then he's forgotten about in prison. This is Joseph's story. And we can't relate to every single one of those circumstances and details, but there's many things that we can relate to from this story. But all of these things that have happened thus far and that brief overview calls us to use these 15 chapters of moral principles for our lives. And if you stop reading this story in Genesis 40, just like we talked about last week, you would conclude that God has abandoned Joseph, that he misunderstood, that these dreams that he had were not right, that this favoritism that he enjoyed in his father's house was misplaced and misguided. But as the Holy Spirit inspired Moses to write these things, one phrase repeats throughout the narrative, in particular in chapter 39. And it's just 5 words. The Lord was with Joseph. 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 4 times there in Genesis chapter 39. Chapter 39, verse 2, chapter 39, verse 3, chapter 39, verse 21, and chapter 39, verse 23. The Lord was with him. So staying put in the promised land or being forced to leave it, going into slavery against your will, the Lord was at work. He was there. He was present in the lives of those men. He's gone from favored son to slavery. He's gone from favor in his father's house to favor in Potiphar's house, but now he finds himself in prison. So one of the things that I think is the most spectacular about Joseph's story is how ordinary it feels. If you look beyond the dreams, the rest of it is just common comings and goings. It's sibling rivalries. It's favoritism. It's hard times in the workplace. It's doing the right thing and things not going your way. There's no spectacular interventions. There's only ordinary events that God governs. Through every single one of those decisions and actions, God's hand is guiding in accordance with his heart. He had renewed through Isaac. But through all these circumstances that we just covered in about 5 minutes, he's preserving his promises through Joseph's story. He's hard at work in both, but they look completely different. Isaac had faith to stay. Joseph had faith even when he was forced to go. I think you look at these circumstances and they can kind of appear random. Depending on the story and the part of Joseph's story that you read, it can seem very lucky or it can seem very unlucky. And it changes quick throughout his story. He goes to Egypt and he finds favor in Potiphar's house and things are going well. Then he's falsely accused and he finds himself in prison. So there's this back and forth in his story the entire time, but these things are not random. They are flashes of God's providence. They are flashes of God being hard at work to preserve what he had put in place through Abraham chapters prior. If we're honest, most of us, when it comes to the word providence, we use this word as a substitute for luck. We might use it in the right context even, but we don't always mean it in terms of God orchestrating something, good or bad, in accordance with his perfect plan for his glory. So we use it as luck. Very seldom do we use providence when something bad happens to us. But we love to attach providence to the good things, right? I nearly had a car crash. God's providence intervened. I thought I had this diagnosis, but God's providence intervened and now I don't have this diagnosis. I nearly had this horrible situation at work, but it came to pass and everything shook out fine. God's providence was hard at work. So if we're not careful, we can take this word that's got very rich doctrinal association and we can reduce it to luck. Well, in this specific circumstance, I got lucky. I didn't have the car accident. I didn't have cancer. I didn't lose my job. I didn't break up with my boyfriend or girlfriend. I didn't have to relocate homes. And so a lot of times we equate these things to luck, and we kind of put the stamp of providence upon them. But providence from God doesn't just cover the near miss, it also covers the fatal crash. Providence from God doesn't just cover the near diagnosis. Providence from God works through the diagnosis when you get it. Providence from God is not just when you have a difficult situation that arises at work that shakes out okay and kind of rolls on downstream and everything's hunky-dory. Providence of God also works within the false accusations. Providence of God is also at work when things are going completely haywire around you. It's not just luck. God's providence applies equally to both. So you look at Joseph's story, and he's not just lucky or unlucky. God is weaving his plan, preserving his word and his promises and his faithfulness to his covenant people through every step of Joseph's journey. And that's the kind of faith that I want to walk with today. That's the kind of faith that I want to step with as a Christian, as a husband, as a father, and certainly as a pastor, that it's not just the close calls that God's providential in, but that God is with me in the bottom of the pit. That God is with me on the mountaintop when I rise in Potiphar's house against all odds after I've been sold into slavery by my brothers. That God is with me when the false accusations come. That God is with me when he brings this story full circle and brings his family to Egypt. And Joseph has risen to the top, second only in the greatest country of the known world at the time, to its leader Pharaoh, to say, everything's okay, here's food for my family, because God's been at work preserving what he wanted to do through this circumstance. That's the kind of faith that I want in God. That's the kind of faith that Joseph has. God doesn't just provide providence to cover the near miss. His providence also covers the bad things that happen to us in life. There have been many people that have explained this well through the years, far more eloquently than I could even begin to do today. But Vodi Bakum, may God rest his soul, may he rest in peace, was the first one that I really heard it from who articulated this so well. So I'm going to attribute this to him, but it's probably been said by many through the years. He said, sovereignty addresses God's authority to rule over and govern his creation. Providence addresses the way he does so. God exists above and beyond his creation. He reigns sovereign. He needs no help. He needs no help in sustaining what he's created. But his providence is how he reigns supreme. It's through those day-by-day decisions. Sometimes it's somebody else's decisions. That's not always even our own. I mean, Joseph didn't do anything technically to get thrown into a pit and to have his death faked and to be sold into slavery. Sometimes we're simply going through life and we're subject to the decisions of others, right? And that's a terrifying place to be sometimes, to know that we are subject, when we leave our house every single day, to how people are paying attention to the road when they drive and if they're on their phone or not. Or if the waiter or the waitress at the restaurant is going to remember our order and get it right if we have an allergy. We're putting our faith in their ability to remember what we said we can and cannot have. There's a lot of things that we face on a day-to-day basis that are completely out of our hands. So it's not just our decisions that we have to trust God's providential through. It's the decisions of others around us as well. And that's the kind of God that Genesis paints the picture of. Providence feels like coincidence when you're living it, but in hindsight, it always looks like God's plan unfolding perfectly. So when we look at these pillars of the Bible and we look at these patriarchs of our faith, we are wise to glean moral principles. And I promise you, I've mapped it out before. You can spend 3 months just on Joseph's life alone looking at the principles that we can apply to our day-to-day lives from his example of faithfulness and obedience and perseverance and how God's hand was with him, and all of that is good and fine and well. And we can glean those moral principles and we can recognize the wonder of God's miracle, but we are to be wowed that through all of these things, staying, going, selling, fleeing, rising in a foreign land, God's hand was writing these stories in accordance with his heart. Through all the human interactions and circumstances that we see through these 15 chapters, it was God's hand that was writing these stories, and God was with these men. And my prayer is that, like them, you will be able to trust God's heart even when you can't see his hand. Even when nothing around you makes sense. You can't explain it. You didn't ask for it. You wanted to leave and you're told to stay. You wanted to stay and you're forced to leave. And everything in between, others' decisions, your decisions, that God's providence is at work in accordance with his sovereignty over his creation. After chapter 39, which is very early in Joseph's story, Moses never again says, the Lord was with Joseph. Those four occurrences come in chapter 39, but that phrase does not appear again in the story of Joseph. We see a shift instead. And my prayer is that through this sermon, through this brief character study of Joseph's life, you can see this shift in your own heart and in your own life today as a child of God, as a head of household, as a parent, as a grandparent, as a Christian, as a member of Calvert Baptist Church, all the different hats that you wear. My prayer today through this message is that you will have this same transformation and shift in your mentality that we see occurred in the life of Joseph. And 3 times towards the back end of his story, we see something else come from Joseph. When he's brought before Pharaoh out of the prison, Genesis 41:16, we read this earlier. It says, "It is not in me to do so. God will give Pharaoh a favorable answer." It's the first time we see this shift. God was with him. God was with him. God was with him. God was with him in Genesis 29. And God brings him to a place where he can do nothing else but look at God's hand unfolding in his life. So when he's finally called out of that pit, of that place that he didn't even deserve to be, he doesn't take credit for himself. He doesn't just praise his ability to interpret dreams. He says, I can't do this, but through me, God will do it. And the position that he has me in right now, God will do this thing. It is not in me, but God will give Pharaoh a favorable answer. When he reveals himself to his brothers during the famine, this is in Genesis 45, verses 5 through 8, he says very briefly, God sent me before you. He's able to take a step back and take inventory of his entire journey at this point, the betrayal, the lies, the deceit, the envy, the jealousy, the bitterness, all of these things that he suffered through at the sake of his brother's hands. And he's able to take a step back and he's now able to see God's hand moving him ahead of his brothers. So he has this big confrontation and he says, God sent me before you. God will do this thing. God will answer this dream. God sent me before you. And the real well-known one-liner from this narrative, when his father Jacob dies, at the end of this story, and his brothers suddenly get a taste of fear because they feel like at this point, the only reason Joseph hasn't totally turned on them and annihilated them is because Jacob was still alive. Jacob passes away. So there at the end of this, in chapter 50, his brothers conspire again. And they're afraid now that Jacob's gone, that Joseph's going to rise up. Now you got to think with like them for a second. They've done wrong by him to the uttermost. He's now saved their life in a foreign land where he is second in command. And the only person that they felt was protecting them from Joseph in his new position of power has died. That's the situation that they're in right now in Genesis chapter 50. And they come to him and they say this eloquent response about how Joseph could spare them and how they're going to bow down to him. And everything's starting to come full circle. And in Genesis chapter 50, verse 20, here's the famous line from Joseph. You meant evil against me, but God meant it for good. God meant it for good. Now listen, I've gone through some tough times in my life, but I haven't had someone throw me in a pit, and I haven't had someone try to kill me, and I haven't had someone send me off to a foreign land against my will and against my better wishes. So I can't compare to this kind of evil. But suffering and sin and experiences are relative. You can't compare your testimony with mine, and I can't compare my testimony with yours. They are what they are to us as individuals, but I can't fathom in my flesh standing before my brothers after my father has passed away and being able to say, you threw me in a pit. You pretended that an animal killed me. You took my coat of many colors and you covered it in the blood of a sacrifice and showed it to our father, and he wept and he mourned over me. You sent me into a foreign land. I've been betrayed. I've been falsely accused. I've been imprisoned. And be able to look them in the eyes and say, God meant this for good. That is trusting Jesus. That is trusting him when our life carries us in his providence to places we never thought we'd be, to places we never expected to go. And if we're honest, places we never wanted to be in the first place. And we'll hear a little bit more about that next Sunday as we tie all of these together at the end of our sermon series. This is a beautiful picture of Joseph and spiritual maturity. In Genesis 39, God tells us he's with Joseph. By Genesis 50, Joseph can tell everyone else where God has been all along. Suddenly, he's able to look back at the end of the story, and he's able to see, even when he couldn't see his hand, that he was trusting God's heart the whole time. And even though these brothers had so much against him, and they had these things that they carried out against him, he knew that they intended it for evil, but that just as God renewed that covenant with Isaac through him staying, through all of these circumstances, God preserved that covenant through Joseph leaving. To have that kind of faith. Again, I want to reiterate, we're often not at one extreme or the other like this. Oftentimes our days are filled with circumstances everywhere in between. It's a little bit of staying, it's a little bit of going. It goes back and forth as the pendulum swings through life. But what Joseph understands is that even though his circumstances changed, God's presence never did. And his location isn't what mattered most. It was God's promises and his presence with him wherever he went. And that deepened over time in his life to the point that he was able to trust God even when he found himself in a place that he never intended to go. Joseph, in our eyes, is a hero. Again, we know the story so well. He's the coat of many colors. He's the dreamer. He's the favorite of Jacob, and Jacob's so well known from the Genesis narrative as well. His story starts as this favored son of great obedience. He's doing everything right, and I think I need to really land the plane by expressing this so we get a full picture of what's happening in Joseph's life. He starts as a son of favor, of great obedience in the land of promise, and his story ends in the land of oppression. In Scripture, Egypt is the land of oppression. It's the land of suffering. It's where God's people go in times of turmoil. So this hero of our faith starts in the land of promise. He's the dreamer. He's got these promises that he received. God's providence is clearly on and over his life, but this hero, he never returns home. He never returns home. His patience and his trust in God's purpose recognize that sometimes God's providence has you stay to fulfill your purpose, but sometimes it has you go in a way that you never expected to go, to a place that you never intended to go. And all we can do is trust that he's with us along the way. So I'm going to ask, as our team comes forward and as we prepare for a time of invitation, for you to take a few moments before I have you stand and just reflect right where you are about your journey. I had a gentleman in our congregation come up to me last Sunday after last week's sermon. And you may remember, if you were here, that I depicted our lives as one of those children's connect the dots pictures. And how when you have one of those pictures, all you can see are the dots at first. But as you work and as you move, the picture slowly starts to come clearer before your eyes. And you see this vision come together, and then suddenly you understand what this was supposed to look like all along. And this gentleman made the point to me, and I think it bears repeating today, is that we don't know which dot we are on someone else's map. We don't know where our pictures overlap. We don't know if we're going through life beside one another, where our obedience is one of renewal, of God continuing to do something just as he said he would right where we are, or if it's one of preservation. And we don't know when those around us are coming into our lives to help preserve us as well. And so as you go throughout your life, as you go throughout your afternoon and your week, and you go back to work tomorrow, and you prepare to put your thinking cap back on and go back into the workplace, and you have all of these ordinary encounters at the gas station, at the grocery store, at the doctor's office, in the waiting room, at work, on the phone, on social media, wherever you find yourself. What I want to encourage you to consider right now is that God's providence is all over that circumstance. It's not just the close calls that you walk away from and kind of, whew, that was close. God's providence is working through every single circumstance that we face in this life. And it could be horrible to us right now, and it could have been directed at us and intended for evil. But God can and desires to use it for good and for his glory. Would you trust him to do that in your life today?